Imagine yourself standing on the deck of a ship, right in the middle of the South Pacific Ocean. It is the year 1722. The year is significant because this is the moment the outside world first stumbles upon one of the greatest mysteries in human history. The water is a deep, endless blue. The air is salty and warm. You have been sailing for weeks, seeing nothing but waves and sky. Then, on the horizon, a tiny speck of land appears. This is Easter Island, or as the people who live there call it, Rapa Nui. The captain of this ship is a Dutch explorer named Jacob Roggeveen. He and his crew are exhausted. They are looking for fresh water and fruit, anything to survive the long journey. But as they get closer to the shore, they see something that makes them stop in their tracks. They rub their eyes, sure that the heat and the sea are playing tricks on their minds. Lining the coast are hundreds of giant stone figures. They aren't sitting down. They are standing. They are staring out to sea with massive stoic faces. Roggeveen and his men lower the small boats and row toward the beach. The sound of the waves crashing against the shore is the only thing you can hear. There is no hum of engines, no city noise, just the wind and the ocean. As they step onto the sand, they feel the heat of the volcanic ground beneath their feet. And there they are. The Moai. You have to understand the scale of these statues to really feel the shock. These aren't little garden gnomes. The average Moai stands about 13 feet tall and weighs around 13 tons. But that is just the average. The really big ones are mind-boggling. There is one seated figure that is over 30 feet high and weighs about 82 tons. To put that in perspective, that is roughly the weight of 12 large African elephants, or maybe 40 pickup trucks stacked on top of each other. And they are carved from hard, solid volcanic rock. Now, think about the date. This is 1722. There are no cranes. There are no bulldozers. There are no steel cables or hydraulic lifts. The most advanced tool Roggeveen has on his ship is a compass and a few cannon. So, seeing these giants standing guard over this isolated island creates a feeling of total disbelief. It feels like walking onto a different planet. But the mystery gets even deeper when you start to look around the island. Roggeveen explored the land, walking through the tall grass and over the sharp, rocky lava fields. What he discovered only added to the confusion. He saw that many of these statues weren't on the coast where they were standing. They were scattered in the middle of the island, some lying on their backs, some half buried in the dirt, as if they fell down while walking home. The source of these statues is a volcanic crater called Rano Raraku. It is a majestic place, a bowl of green grass nestled inside a collapsed volcano. If you stand on the rim of this crater today, you can see the birthplace of the Moai. It is like an open-air factory. There are nearly 400 statues still in various stages of completion here. Some are just rough outlines carved into the rock face. Others are finished, attached to a thin strip of stone at their backs. They look like they are waiting to be cut loose. Here is the problem that would baffle scientists for the next 300 years. The quarry, the factory where these stones were born, is inside this volcano. But the platforms where the statues were meant to stand, the Aho, are mostly located on the coast. And that is a long way to go. The distance from the quarry to the nearest coast is about 6 miles. That might not sound like far if you are driving a car. But try to imagine pushing a refrigerator across a soft, sandy beach for just 1 mile. Now multiply that weight by 80, and you have to go 6 miles. You have to go over hills, through uneven terrain, and across jagged lava fields that would tear apart even the toughest shoes. So the question hangs in the air, heavy and persistent. How did a small group of people living on an island with very few resources manage to move 80-ton monoliths across miles of difficult ground without modern technology? When you look at the island today, you notice something else that makes this puzzle even harder. There are almost no trees. It is a grassy, windswept landscape. For a long time, historians and archaeologists looked at this and thought, well, they must have used logs. If you want to move something heavy, you put it on rollers. You cut down trees, lay them on the ground, and roll the stone over them. It is a method used by ancient Egyptians and other civilizations. But here is the catch. By the time Roggeveen arrived in 1722, the island was already deforested. There were no big trees left. If the Rapa Nui people used up all their trees just to move these statues, it would explain why the island looks the way it does now. It paints a picture of a people who became so obsessed with building these giants that they destroyed their own environment. They cut down the last tree to move the last statue, leaving themselves with no wood for canoes, no wood for shelter, and no way to escape the island they had stripped bare. This theory, often called ecocide, makes for a dramatic and sad story. It suggests that the Moai were a curse. It makes you look at the stone faces and feel a sense of tragedy. You imagine the carvers, chipping away at the rock, knowing that with every swing of their stone tools, they were using up a precious resource they would never get back. But if you stand there, feeling the wind coming off the ocean, and you look closely at the ground, something doesn't quite add up. If they dragged these massive stones on logs, where are the marks? Dragging 80 tons over the ground leaves scars. It leaves deep ruts in the soil. It leaves a path of destruction that you can still see centuries later. And while the island has many old roads, they don't look like drag marks. Plus, think about the sheer manpower. If you try to drag an 80-ton stone on a wooden sledge, the friction is enormous. It is like trying to move a boulder through thick mud. Physics works against you every inch of the way. You would need hundreds, maybe thousands of people pulling on ropes. And if a rope snaps or a log breaks, the statue could crush the workers in an instant. There is also the human element to consider. The Rapa Nui people were not robots. They were living, breathing humans. They had families to feed, crops to tend, and houses to build. Could they really afford to take every able-bodied man away from fishing and farming for years just to drag a rock? It seems like a terrible waste of energy for a society trying to survive. As the sun sets over Rano Raraku, the light hits the stone faces in a way that makes them look almost alive. The shadows lengthen, and you can see the details in their eyes, the hollows where coral eyes were once inserted, the sharp noses, the pursed lips. These were ancestors. They were representations of former chiefs and important gods. They were not just decoration. They were a spiritual connection to the past. This emotional connection changes the way you look at the problem. Would you drag your grandfather's face through the mud? Would you risk your life and the life of your village to haul a sacred object on a sledge that might break it? Probably not. You would treat it with reverence. You would move it with care. So we are left with this impossible contradiction. The statues are too big to move easily. The ground is too rough for wheels or sledges. The island is too barren to provide timber. And the people were too respectful to treat their ancestors like cargo. It is no wonder that when Raghaveen asked the locals how the statues got there, they probably didn't understand the question. To them, it wasn't a mystery of engineering. It was a part of their history. According to local legends passed down through generations, the answer was simple, and to the European mind, impossible. The elders said the statues didn't need to be dragged. They said the Moai walked. Of course, Raghaveen and the scientists who came after him laughed at this. Stones don't walk, they said. They dismissed the legends as fairy tales. They decided that the primitive people must have forgotten how their ancestors did it, or they were just making up stories to confuse the white men. For nearly 300 years, this was the deadlock. The Western world was stuck on the idea that the only way to move something heavy is to drag it. They tried to imagine complex systems of ramps, levers, and pulleys. They drew blueprints of massive wooden frames that would have required more timber than the island ever had. But the silence of the statues remained unbroken. Every time a new theory was tested, it failed. It required too much wood, or too much rope, or too many people. The math never worked out. The mystery seemed destined to remain a mystery forever. Yet, if you listen closely to the wind on Rapa Nui, you might hear a different story. You might hear a rhythmic thumping, like a heartbeat. You might realize that the answer was hiding in plain sight, written in the physics of the statues themselves. The heavy D-shaped bases, the forward-leaning posture, the slightly bent knees, it all adds up to something. The problem was never about the lack of technology. The problem was that we were looking at the Moai as dead weight. We were seeing a burden that had to be overcome. We forgot that the people who built them were masters of their environment. They understood the laws of gravity and balance, not from books, but from feeling the motion of the ocean and the rock beneath their feet. The stage is set. We have a remote island, a desperate people, and giant stones that seem to defy the laws of physics. We have a mystery that has confused the smartest minds for centuries. But sometimes, the solution to a hard problem isn't about adding more force. It is about changing your perspective. And sometimes, you have to stop trying to drag the mountain and start learning how to dance with it. Picture yourself back on that grassy, windswept island. We left off with a huge question mark hanging in the salty air. It's the middle of the 20th century, and the smartest people in the world are still scratching their heads. They are looking at these 80-ton giants, and they are completely stumped. The year is 1955, and the mystery of the Moai is about to turn into a full-blown scientific obsession. Up until this point, most researchers were stuck on one very simple idea. If you want to move something heavy, you have to drag it. It is the most natural thing in the world. Think about when you move a heavy couch. You don't pick it up and walk with it. You shove it across the floor. So, scientists assumed the ancient Rapa Nui people thought exactly the same way. This led to the dominant theory, the log rolling hypothesis. It seemed to make perfect sense on paper. The logic was that the island was once covered in giant palm trees. The islanders, the theory went, cut down these massive trees, laid them on the ground like a set of train tracks, and placed the huge statues on top. Then, using hundreds of people pulling on ropes made from tree bark, they would roll the statues over the logs. If you close your eyes, you can almost hear it. The creaking of the wood under the immense weight, the groaning of the ropes, the rhythmic chanting of workers pulling in unison. You can feel the tension in the air as hundreds of men heave against the stone, straining every muscle to move the statue just 1 inch. But there was a major problem with this picture, a dark problem. If the islanders used up all their trees to move these statues, they would have destroyed their own home. They would have cut down the very forest that provided them with canoes for fishing, wood for shelter, and soil to grow crops. This theory, popularized by ecologists in the 1970s and 80s, painted a very sad picture. It turned the story of the Moai into a story of suicide. It suggested that the people were so obsessed with their stone gods that they didn't realize they were chopping down their last tree. This narrative became known as ecocide. It made the Rapa Nui ancestors look like people who couldn't plan ahead. It made their society look like a cautionary tale about destroying the environment. For the descendants living on the island today, this was a painful thing to hear. Imagine being told that your wise ancestors were actually foolish people who destroyed their paradise just to move some rocks. But despite the sadness of this theory, scientists still needed to prove that it was actually possible to move the statues this way. You can't just say it happened. You have to show the physics work. And this brings us to one of the most famous explorers of the 20th century, a man named Thor Heyerdahl. You might have heard of Heyerdahl. He was the Norwegian adventurer who famously sailed a raft called the Kon-Tiki across the Pacific to prove that ancient people could have traveled long distances. He was a man who loved action. He didn't like sitting in an office guessing. He wanted to get out there and do it. In 1955, Heyerdahl arrived on Easter Island with a team of eager helpers. He was determined to solve the mystery once and for all. He wasn't interested in aliens or magic. He believed in human muscle, grit, and simple engineering. He looked at the Moai and said, "We can move this." He didn't try to move an 80-ton statue right away, of course. That would be too dangerous. Instead, he commissioned a local group to carve a concrete replica. This statue wasn't small. It was about 13 feet tall and weighed roughly 5 to 6 tons. To you and me, that sounds incredibly heavy. It's about the weight of a large African elephant. But compared to the real giants, it was a baby. Heyerdahl's plan was straightforward. He built a giant wooden sled, almost like a cradle, and strapped the concrete Moai onto it horizontally. Then he laid down a track of wooden logs. He gathered a team of islanders, and on a bright, sunny morning, they began to pull. At first, it looked like it might work. The ropes went tight. The men leaned forward, digging their bare feet into the dirt. The sled groaned. Slowly, agonizingly slowly, the concrete statue began to slide across the logs. But then, the reality of the physics set in. Moving 6 tons on a wooden sled creates a massive amount of friction. The logs didn't roll smoothly. They dug into the soft earth. The sled got stuck. The ropes were burning the hands of the workers. Every time they pulled it a few feet, they had to stop, run to the back, and move the logs from the rear to the front. It was back-breaking, tedious work. You could feel the frustration in the air. What should have been a glorious march to the coast turned into a slow crawl. They were exhausted. Their muscles were aching. The sun was beating down on them, and the dust was flying everywhere. Heyerdahl realized that dragging this baby statue was hard enough. Moving a real one, weighing 80 tons, would be a nightmare. The friction would increase exponentially. The ropes would need to be as thick as a man's torso, and the sheer number of people required to pull it would be so large that they wouldn't even have room to stand on the narrow paths. But Heyerdahl was stubborn. He didn't give up. If he couldn't drag it easily, he was going to figure out how to get it to the coast one way or another. He eventually decided to use a different method for getting the statue upright. He built a massive wooden ramp, a pile of stones and logs, and used a lever system to inch the statue up the slope until it tipped over onto its platform. It worked. The statue stood up. The team cheered. They had proven that with enough wood, enough time, and enough muscle, you could move a Moai. However, Heyerdahl himself admitted it wasn't a perfect solution. He noted that using his method, moving the hundreds of statues on the island would have required an insane amount of timber. And as we know, the island didn't have an endless supply of trees. The experiment highlighted the very problem we started with. The environmental cost was too high. For decades after Heyerdahl, the log rolling theory stayed the main answer in textbooks, but it left a bad taste in many people's mouths. It just felt wrong. It felt clumsy. Think about the feeling of it. Dragging a sacred ancestor face down through the dirt and mud, scraping the stone, damaging the carving. It feels disrespectful. It feels like a violation of the spirit of the statue. The Rapa Nui people were expert carvers. They spent months, sometimes years, polishing these figures with stone tools, making the back smooth and the details sharp. Why would they then ruin all that hard work by dragging it over a rough log road? And there was another logical snag that kept scientists awake at night. The roads on the island didn't look like drag roads. If you drag a heavy object over the same path for hundreds of years, you create deep ruts. You carve grooves into the rock. But the ancient roads on Easter Island are actually concave-shaped like a shallow U. Some researchers suggested maybe the statues were moved on a canoe-type sled, shaped like the hull of a boat. This was tested too. But even with a canoe sled, the friction was a killer. It still required hundreds of people pulling. Imagine being one of those pullers. You are at the back of the line. The rope is rough against your shoulders. You are pulling up a slope. The statue ahead of you is heavy, dead weight. If you slip, or if the person in front of you slips, the rope can snap back and hurt you. If the sled tips over, the statue could crush your legs. It feels dangerous and chaotic. The struggle to understand the Moai became a mirror for our own modern world. We looked at the past and saw our own struggles. We saw people consuming resources until they ran out. We saw brute force as the only way to solve big problems. The story became a tragedy of human limitations. By the 1980s, the mood was somber. The mystery seemed solved, but the solution was depressing. We had turned the brilliant engineers of Rapa Nui into tragic environmentalists who destroyed their world. We told the story that they moved the statues by dragging them, killing their forest, and ultimately themselves. But there was a quiet group of people who weren't satisfied with this ending. They were the outcasts, the dreamers, and the listeners. They looked at the U-shaped roads again. They looked at the statues with their forward lean and their big bellies. They listened to the old stories that said the statues walked. One of these people was a Czech engineer named Pavel. He wasn't a famous archaeologist. He was just a regular guy who liked to solve puzzles. In the 1980s, he watched a documentary about the Moai, and he had a sudden spark of an idea. He looked at the shape of the statue and thought, this isn't a box. This is a pendulum. He realized something that Heyerdahl had missed. Heyerdahl treated the statue like a brick. He laid it down and dragged it. But Pavel looked at the statue and saw something that wanted to stand up. He noticed that the center of gravity of a Moai is different from a rectangular block. Because of the heavy head and the curved belly, the statue naturally wants to rock forward onto its toes and then back onto its heels. He started doing calculations in his head. He didn't need logs. He didn't need a sled. He just needed rhythm. He believed that by tilting the statue side to side, you could make it walk. This sounds crazy, right? Making a rock walk? It sounds like a fairy tale. But Pavel was so convinced he was right that he decided to test it. He built a small model in his backyard, just a few feet tall. He tied ropes to the top of its head. He pulled one side to make it tilt, then the other. And sure enough, the little model shuffled forward. It waddled. It walked. The excitement must have been electric. Here was a solution that didn't require destroying the forest. Here was a method that kept the statue upright, facing the sky, treating it with the respect an ancestor deserves. It was fast, it was efficient, and it used the laws of physics rather than fighting against them. But a model in a backyard is one thing. A real 10-ton statue in the middle of the Pacific is another. Pavel needed help. He needed a stage to prove this to the world, and he knew exactly who to call. He reached out to the most famous explorer in the world, the very man who had tried to drag the statues decades earlier. He called Thor Heyerdahl. It must have been a strange conversation. "Mr. Heyerdahl, you dragged them, but I think they can walk. Come back to the island and let me show you." Amazingly, Heyerdahl listened. He was older now, but he was still a seeker of truth. If there was a better way, he wanted to see it. So plans were made for a new expedition. This time, they weren't bringing chainsaws to build sleds. They were bringing ropes, open minds, and a group of strong, willing local volunteers. The stage was set for a showdown between the old way and the new way. The year was 1986. The location was the same volcanic quarry where the ancestors had worked centuries ago. The air was thick with anticipation. They prepared a concrete statue. It was heavier than the first one. Heyerdahl used about 10 tons. It stood there, silent and imposing, waiting for the ropes to be attached. The skeptics stood on the sidelines, arms crossed, waiting for Pavel to fail. They were ready to say, "See? It's impossible. You can't make stone walk." Pavel walked up to the statue. He didn't lay it down. He didn't put it on a sled. He stood it up. He tied 3 ropes around the head, one on each side and one in the front to guide it. He gathered the team. There were only about 16 people. That's a tiny number compared to the hundreds that the dragging theories required. Just 16 men and women standing in front of a 10-ton giant. Pavel gave the signal. Pull left. The team leaned back on the left rope. The massive statue tipped over. For a heart-stopping second, it looked like it might fall. But then the team on the right pulled. The statue swayed back. It tipped onto its other edge. And then something magical happened. As the statue rocked back, it pivoted. The heavy base lifted slightly off the ground and moved forward a few inches. It wasn't a slide. It was a step. The stone had moved. The team found a rhythm. Left, right, left, right. It was like a dance. The statue swayed like a massive pendulum. With each rock, it shuffled forward. Step by step, the giant began to move. The sound wasn't the screech of wood on stone or the grinding of a sledge. It was a dull, rhythmic thud, asterisk thud, step, thud, step. Asterisk, the skeptics stopped crossing their arms. Their mouths fell open. They were watching the impossible happen. The statue was walking. It was swaying its hips, moving under its own power, guided by the rhythm of the human team. It was fast. In a matter of minutes, they moved the 10-ton statue a significant distance. They even managed to turn a corner, something that would have been a nightmare with a log sled. Pavel had cracked the code. He hadn't just moved a rock. He had vindicated the Rapa Nui elders. He had proven that the old legends weren't just stories. The statue's asterisk could asterisk walk. But there was still one final hurdle. Pavel's statue was 10 tons. The biggest Moai on the island were 80 tons. The physics of the rocking method worked great for 10 tons. But did it work for the really big guys? Could you really make an 80-ton giant walk without it snapping in half? The struggle wasn't over yet. The revelation had begun, but the ultimate test of strength and balance was still to come. The scientists realized they were on the right path, but they needed to refine the technique. They needed to understand the exact physics of an 80-ton pendulum. As the sun set on that 1986 experiment, the feeling on the island was different. The tragedy of the ecocide theory began to fade. The picture of the foolish ancestors destroying their forest started to crumble. In its place, a new image was emerging, one of brilliant, intelligent engineers who worked in harmony with gravity and stone. They weren't draggers. They were dancers. And we were finally learning their steps. The sun was setting over the island, casting long, dramatic shadows across the grass. The year was 1986, and the dust was settling on a remarkable experiment. A Czech engineer named Pavel had just done the impossible. He had taken a 10-ton concrete replica of a Moai, and using only ropes and a small team, made it walk. But as the excitement of that moment faded, a nagging question remained. Yes, they had moved a 10-ton statue. But the real giants of Easter Island, the ones that truly boggled the mind, weighed up to 80 tons. That is 8 times heavier than the one Pavel had moved. To put that in perspective, if a 10-ton statue is a heavy pickup truck, an 80-ton statue is a fully loaded commercial airliner. Pavel's experiment had a scary side effect. The concrete statue he moved had actually started to crack under the stress. The rocking motion worked, but the violent swaying put enormous pressure on the stone. If a 10-ton concrete block was cracking, what would happen to a real 80-ton basalt rock? Would it shatter? Would it snap at the ankles and crush the workers? For a while, the hope of a walking solution dimmed. It seemed too dangerous. The physics seemed to suggest that while small statues could dance, the big ones were simply too heavy to survive the journey. The skeptics crept back in, whispering that maybe the old log-rolling theory was right after all, simply because the scale of the task was so massive. But science is funny. It doesn't give up just because something is hard. It just takes a break, regroups, and comes back with a better plan. Fast forward to the year 2011. A new team of adventurers arrived on the island. This time, it wasn't just an engineer, an explorer. It was a team led by 2 American archaeologists, Terry Hunt and Carl Lipo. They had spent years studying the island, the soil, and the statues. They were convinced that Pavel was onto something, but they thought the method needed a tweak. They believed the key wasn't just force, but finesse asterisk. Hunt and Lipo wanted to test the walking theory one last time, but they wanted to do it with the utmost care. They didn't have an 80-ton block to play with. Shipping something that heavy to the middle of the Pacific is a nightmare of logistics, but they built a faithful replica that weighed about 5 tons. It was heavy enough to be dangerous, but light enough to manage safely if things went wrong. The location for the experiment was a dusty, open field. The air was hot and dry. The team gathered around the statue. It looked like a giant, gray giant sleeping on the ground. They didn't lay it on a sled. They stood it up. They attached thick, synthetic ropes to the head, the same spot Pavel had used. Now, here is where the genius of the new method came in. Hunt and Lipo realized that you don't just pull the statue back and forth to make it rock. You need to control the energy. You need to treat the statue like a pendulum. They divided the volunteers into 3 teams. One team stood in the back, holding a rope to stop the statue from falling over forward. It acted as a brake. The other 2 teams stood on the left and right sides. The anticipation was palpable. You could feel the tension in the air. Everyone was sweating, wiping their foreheads, looking at the stone giant that towered over them. The order was given. The team on the left pulled. The statue tilted. Its left edge lifted off the ground. For a split second, 5 tons of stone was balancing on a tiny point of rock. Then the team on the right pulled. The statue swayed back. It tilted to the right. But something was different this time. It wasn't jerky. It was smooth. The statue didn't lurch. It flowed. As it rocked right, the base pivoted. It took a tiny step. Asterisk, thump. Asterisk, then left. Asterisk, thump. Asterisk, the rhythm was like a heartbeat. Asterisk, thump, 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 thump. Asterisk, it sounds simple, but watching it happen was mesmerizing. The statue began to move across the field. It wasn't sliding. It was waddling. It looked like a massive penguin walking down the beach. The heavy D-shaped base of the statue, which had always confused people who tried to drag it, was suddenly the star of the show. That wide, curved bottom allowed the stone to roll forward and back without digging into the dirt. The team fell into a trance-like state. They were chanting, pulling in time with the sway. The sound of the stone hitting the earth was a steady, low bass note that vibrated in their chests. In just 40 minutes, this team of fewer than 20 people moved the 5-ton statue over 300 feet. That is faster than walking speed. That is faster than you could drag it with a tractor in some cases. And they did it without breaking a sweat. Relatively speaking, they weren't fighting the stone. They were dancing with it. Have you ever seen those giant stone heads and wondered, what's their story? Well, today we read diving deep into one of the world's greatest mysteries, the Moai statues of Easter Island. This remote speck of land in the southeastern Pacific Ocean is home to nearly 1,000 of these colossal figures, standing as silent witnesses to a lost civilization. So grab your explorer's hat, because we're about to uncover the secrets of Rapa Nui. First, let's get our bearings. Easter Island, or Rapa Nui, as it's known by its inhabitants, is one of the most isolated inhabited islands on Earth. It's thousands of kilometers from any continent. And yet, sometime between the years 1200 and 1500, a society of Polynesian settlers flourished here, embarking on one of the most remarkable artistic and engineering feats in human history. They carved the Moai. These statues are monolithic, meaning each one is carved from a single piece of stone, and they are huge. The average Moai stands about 4 meters tall and weighs a staggering 14 tons. That's like 2 adult elephants. The tallest one ever erected, named Paro, was almost 10 meters high and weighed over 80 tons. But here's the kicker. There's an even bigger, unfinished Moai still in the quarry that would have been over 20 meters tall and weighed around 270 tons. Can you even imagine trying to move that? So, who are these giant figures supposed to be? The prevailing theory is that the Moai are living faces, or Aringa Ora, representing deified ancestors. They were carved by the Rapa Nui people to honor their chiefs and other important figures who had passed away. Think of them as spiritual guardians, channeling the mana, or spiritual power, of the ancestors to protect the clan, bring good harvests, and ensure fertility. This is why most Moai face inland, watching over their descendants in the villages, not out to sea, as many people mistakenly believe. Only a few special statues, at a site called Ahu Akivi, were positioned to face the ocean. Now for the million-dollar question. How did they move them? This has puzzled archaeologists for centuries. The main quarry, Rano Raraku, is where almost all the Moai were carved directly from the volcanic tuff. From there, they had to be transported several kilometers across the island's hilly terrain to their final destinations. The ceremonial platforms called Ahu. There are a few popular theories. One suggests the statues were laid on their backs on wooden sledges and pulled over rollers, a bit like a giant conveyor belt. This would have required a massive amount of timber and a huge workforce. Another fascinating idea, and one that has been tested with some success, is that the statues were walked upright. By using ropes tied around the head and base, teams of people could rock the statue from side to side, inching it forward in a shuffling motion. Imagine seeing one of these giants slowly walking across the landscape. The Rapa Nui people have legends that say the Moai walked from the quarry, which makes this theory even more compelling. Let's talk about the carving process itself. The Rapa Nui used stone tools called toki, made from a harder rock called basalt. Carving a single Moai would have taken a team of about 5 or 6 carvers roughly a year to complete. The details are incredible. They have elongated noses, strong chins, and deep eye sockets that were originally inlaid with white coral and red scoria to create striking, lifelike eyes. Once the front and sides were finished, they break it away from the bedrock and slide it down the slope to be stood upright for the back to be carved. You might have noticed that some Moai wear a hat. This hat is actually a separate piece called a pukao. It's a cylindrical topknot made from a reddish volcanic rock found in a different quarry. These pukao could weigh up to 12 tons themselves and were placed on top of the statues after they were erected on their platforms. This was another incredible engineering challenge. probably accomplished by building a giant ramp of stones and earth. The pukao likely symbolized a top knot of hair, a sign of power and prestige in Polynesian culture. But here's where the story takes a darker turn. What happened to the people who built them? The civilization that created the Moai eventually collapsed. By the time Europeans first arrived in the 18th century, the island was largely treeless, and the population had dwindled dramatically. Many of the statues had been toppled, likely during periods of internal conflict between different clans. The leading theory for this collapse is ecocide, the relentless construction of the Moai, the need for wood to transport them, and the clearing of land for agriculture led to catastrophic deforestation. Without trees, the islanders couldn't build good canoes for fishing. The soil eroded, and resources became scarce. This led to starvation, warfare, and the downfall of their complex society. The very obsession that defined their culture may have ultimately led to its demise. It's a powerful and cautionary tale for our own time, isn't it? However, recent research offers a more nuanced view. Some scientists argue that the arrival of Polynesian rats, who came on the first canoes and ate the seeds of the palm trees, played a major role in the deforestation. Others point to the devastating effects of diseases and the slave trade introduced by outsiders in the 19th century as the final blow to the Rapa Nui people. The truth is likely a combination of all these factors. It's a complex history, not a simple story of self-destruction. What many people don't realize is that the Moai we see in pictures are not just heads. For a long time, everyone thought of them as giant heads buried in the ground. But in the 2010s, excavations revealed that the statues have full bodies extending several meters underground. The bodies are often covered in intricate carvings, like tattoos, which have been perfectly preserved by the soil. These petroglyphs depict canoes, birds, and other symbols, giving us even more insight into the culture and beliefs of the ancient Rapa Nui. It's like discovering a hidden chapter in their story. Today, Easter Island is a UNESCO World Heritage Site, and the Moai are its most famous ambassadors. The Rapa Nui people have shown incredible resilience. Their culture is undergoing a revival, and they are the proud guardians of their ancestral heritage. Visiting the island is a profound experience. Standing in the shadow of these stone giants, you can't help but feel a sense of awe and wonder at the ingenuity, artistry, and spiritual devotion of the people who created them. The Moai of Easter Island are more than just statues. They are a bridge to a lost world, a symbol of human achievement, and a stark reminder of our fragile relationship with the environment. They keep their secrets well, but with every new discovery, we get a little closer to understanding the incredible story of Rapa Nui. Thank you so much for joining me on this journey to one of the most mysterious places on Earth. What part of the Moai story fascinates you the most? Let me know in the comments below. And if you enjoyed this video, don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit that notification bell for more adventures into the mysteries of our world. See you next time.